Speaking of the international struggle, in the end of 2020, more than 250 million Indian farmers and workers recorded the largest strike in human history. This was an event which, of course, received no serious coverage in the Western media. Can you speak a bit about the state of class struggle in India? From the perspective of an outsider, it seems that the communists in India have been a lot better at integrating themselves with the various socialist organizations and worker and farmer unions in the country than we have in the US, where the relations between socialist organizations seems to be more one of exclusion than unification or coalition building. So what role do the communist parties in India play in political life, and what can US communists take away from the incredible successful examples of communist governance such as those in Kerala?
So, Eddie, that's a great question. And I'm happy to talk about the farmers. I could go on at great length, but I want to be a little careful of how I explain this. There are two authors, let's say, to this struggle, the great farmers' revolt, let's say, the Kisan Commune. There are two authors to this. There are actually two authors to all struggles. One is more objective factors, and the other is subjective. Let's take them in turn. In terms of the objective factors, I mean, after the Indian economy was opened up to what's called liberalization, neoliberalism, and so on, the condition of farming life was under attack. Agrarian credit structures were broken. The government sort of pushed farmers to intensify production with more fertilizers, more pesticides, and so on, to try to intensify production to increase yields with different kinds of seeds and so on and so forth. This made farming very expensive, and many farmers went into a immense debt. The debt crisis for farmers in the 1990s is significant. Now, my colleague at Tricontinental, my friend and the great journalist P. Sainath, he uncovered in the early 2000s that in about a decade or so, maybe 15 years, almost a third of 1 million Indian farmers committed suicide. The immediate reaction to the deteriorating objective conditions was self-harm. By the way, Sainath and I looked at the situation in the United States. And after the collapse of small farms in the US in the 1980s, you might remember Willie Nelson started the Farm Aid project to try to help farmers. In fact, from that time onward, there was a kind of self-harm that is inflicted upon farming communities. This self-harm comes in two different ways. One, there were very high rates of both suicide and murder in farming communities. I wrote a story about a family in Iowa where the farmer comes back from the bank, takes his gun, shoots his entire family, and shoots himself. This was called a mass killing. In fact, it's a collective suicide as a consequence of the farmers' crisis. The other, of course, is the entry of crystal meth into farming communities to substitute for farming. Also a form of self-harm, because those communities were racked. They were destroyed by the entry of crystal meth. So the objective factors produced a really desolate situation for Indian farmers in the 90s and early 2000s. And then in comes, fascinatingly, the farmers' movement. Now, it has taken generations to build the farmers' movement in India. The All India Kisan Sabha was founded in 1936 by the communists. Communists have been building the All India Kisan Sabha for decades, working in struggles all across the country. In particular, in Maharashtra, a few years ago, the All India Kisan Sabha organized a mass march of farmers. Maharashtra was hard hit by drought, hard hit by collapsing commodity prices, and so on. Farmers there went on a long march from Nasik into Bombay. This was an enormous event. It was covered by the media, particularly when the farmers entered Bombay. They were informed that the next day there was going to be an examination for students, and that their farm was going to disrupt this important exam for students. So the farmer leaders took a decision that they'd march all night so as not to disrupt the students. This earned them an enormous amount of goodwill from the middle class in the cities. It also built up a kind of sentiment among farmers that they can win, because they did win some gains in that struggle in Maharashtra. There was another struggle in Rajasthan. Again, farmers went on a general strike and they won gains from that state government. Well, when Mr. Modi decided to go put the whip against farmers with three farm bills, two things happened. One is the objective condition of farming was already deteriorating, already in a terrible state, and they simply didn't want to see the Uberization of farm life. They did not want to allow that. And subjectively, the victories in Maharashtra, the victories in Rajasthan, the work of the All India Kisan Sabha, the farmers' union, which is built and developed by the communists, their communist links with community organizations, with other farmers groups and so on, they gathered together and they conducted this major farm strike, and they made Mr. Modi withdraw those farm bills. One of the few political defeats suffered by Modi. But here I want to caution things. We in the left are very good at building these struggles, winning essentially this battle in the class struggle or that battle in the class struggle. But comrades, here's the difficulty. Shortly after the victory, there was an election in the state of Uttar Pradesh, the largest state in India. Some 250 million people live in that state. It is a base area for the Hindu far right of Mr. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India. It's a real base for him. And as I said, it's the largest state in India. Well, the entire western part of that state participated one way or the other in the farmers' struggle. But after the struggle had been won, farmers went back home and they re-elected the party of Mr. Modi to governance. Now, I have personally had this experience before in 1989 while canvassing for my comrade Subhashini Ali under the red flag, the communist flag, to be a member of parliament in the town of Kanpur, which is a working class town. I remember going from house to house in these working class mill areas where farmers would tell us, listen, comrade, factory workers would tell us, listen, comrade, we are with you when it comes to strikes. We are with you in the workplace, but we're going to vote for the Congress when it comes to elections because they give us electricity connections, they give us water and so on, the kind of patron-client money relationship of democracy. We have to have a serious discussion about how bourgeois democracy is so inflicted with money that even if we build mass capacity in major struggles, to translate that into a political victory is very difficult. By political, I mean an electoral victory. It's very difficult. We have to come to terms with that. Bourgeois democracy serves a penalty against the bulk of people. Even when they are organized and winning mass struggles, they are penalized when it comes to bourgeois democratic elections. And that's what is part of the unfortunate experience of the farmers' struggle.
Well, I could sit here and talk about the farming struggle for hours and hours, especially with how important it is right now concerning the plans of the WEF and all that. But for the moment, let's just shift over to the U.S. We seem to be entering here a period of intensified radicalization in the 2020s. Everywhere you look, everyone is questioning capitalism, questioning war, questioning really what our ruling class even tells us reality is. So often, though, they end up sort of missing the mark or just coming up with radical sounding ways to support imperialist organizations like the Democratic Party and things like that. So my question to you is really, what's up with that? How do we take what seems like an almost automatic right opportunism into a more progressive direction with more than just voting for Democrats as the ultimate end result, even of street actions?
It's really interesting to see this. And I wrote to, I think, Eddie, maybe a year or so ago, saying I was very happy to encounter the work you're doing at Midwestern Marxism and so on. That, the fact that Midwestern Marx exists and that people are having these discussions and debate and so on gives me a great sense of joy, because it's wonderful to see people having these discussions. Again, there's an objective reason for it. I mean, the mainstream economists say in places like the United States that earlier dream that children of families will have a better standard of living than their parents. That dream has gone a generation ago. Before you, it had already withered. But now it's becoming clearer and clearer to families that people are convulsed, bathed in debt, unable to really exercise any kind of dream or an American dream and so on. That this debt crisis has been a severe infliction for people. That you have college debt over $1 trillion, total college debt in the United States. It's incredible. And so people objectively are feeling the problems. Look at the state of work these days. I mean, look at the state of work. What does it mean to work as in the delivery business, or to work at Amazon, or even to have a middle management job? The conditions of work are so abysmal that there has been some sort of searching for alternatives. And secondly, I do feel that the impact of the campaign of Bernie Sanders was significant. Now, I may not agree with Mr. Sanders on everything, but he certainly ran an impressive campaign where he talked about the practical possibilities of some kind of socialism in the United States. He put on the table the fact that education need not be commodified, that you could have education be an entity that comes out of the social wealth. You can have higher education institutions. You don't have to commodify that. He put on the table the possibility of having public transportation decommodified. I mean, all of this is important. It started a conversation and it radicalized. That's what often happens. Out of the Bernie period, you got the emergence of the Democratic Socialists of America. You got to pay attention to the fact that all these discussions, all these developments are taking place without a historical link to past, communist or left-wing traditions in the United States, because those forces had been deeply weakened and were not able to influence these developments. So you're going to have all kinds of chaotic things happening. People are like magpies, drawing ideas from here, there, everywhere. That's why you see in the DSA a range of opinions that exist and so on. I just think this process must be accompanied. Let's see where it goes. Let's try to provide some sort of intellectual discussion here. Let's try to give people new things to read. Let's try to deepen their assessment of what they're understanding, deepen their own struggles that they're involved in, and so on. So that, for instance, this wave of struggles in Amazon and Starbucks and whatnot don't once again be hegemonized by the kind of business unionism of the AFL-CIO, but they have a different kind of progressive socialist direction, perhaps more oriented to the communities, that in which they live, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, in that sense, all I can say is that I think it's for reasons of the deterioration of life in places like the United States, but also it had to do with this subjective, factor, which is the campaign of Mr. Sanders, the kind of development of these new groups. And I would say to you, I mean, in the Institute, you play an important role because you are able to, in a sense, amplify new debates and dialogues with people who are being radicalized and brought into the movement. It's silly to assume that people enter these movements, become part of these forces fully formed. Come on, when I was young, I came into the left without having read anything. I came into the left through the protest movements, through struggles, getting involved in the student movement and things. I later read books. I didn't read the books and then come to struggles. Very few people do that. Most people come the other way around. I was far more interested in punk rock music than I was in, Karl Marx. Later, I understood the importance of reading Marx and so on. For me, radicalism came from, a lot of it was from California punk rock, from the Dead Kennedys and so on. That's where I got my radicalism. Later, I read Marx and got more serious about the battle of ideas and so on. You are at an advanced position in a platform like Midwest and Marx. You can provide people with direction that might interest them and might amplify and stimulate new kinds of debates and discussions.
I think that's wonderfully said. And just real quick before we hop on to the next question, one of the things you mentioned with the emergence of the Bernie movement was that there was no historical link to a past American socialist struggle or struggle of the popular forces. And that's one of the things that we have been really fighting against since the inception of our project, this conception that on the one hand, you have the US and the American working people. On the other hand, you have socialism. And there's this unbridgeable gap between the two, because that's very, very false. You know, one of the things that we have been doing in a part of our project, that's the Journal of American Socialist Studies, is showing how even from the beginning of the 19th century, very Marxist-like theories have been developing from the American socialist struggle before Marx, 2-3 decades before Marx and Engels ever wrote anything of significance in the mid-40s. And so I think this is such an important part of our struggle today, having those historical linkages which show that the struggle we are waging on today is waged on historical legs, and that there have been people before us that have waged it, that have died waging them, that have faced imprisonment and repression of various forms in order to bring about a socialist USA. So.
Yeah, and when you talk about the radicalization of Bernie, or the radicalization of a lot of people who were drawn to politics by Bernie, I think practically we've been trying to push people to just raise the property question, you know, go to protests, go to places people are organizing, and raise the question of property and of socialism, and point the critique at capitalism. And Carlos and I were both heavily involved in the Bernie campaign, and, you know, saw a lot of people who were able to radicalize